IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Ganatantra podcast. I am Saryu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
In this week's episode, we are here to discuss women in Parliament. And we are joined to do this by Dr. Carole Spary. Dr. Carole Spary joined Nottingham as an assistant professor in September 2014. Prior to this, she was a lecturer in politics at the University of York and the Leverhulme postdoctoral fellow at the University of Warwick. She has a PhD in politics from the University of Bristol. Dr. Spary's research and teaching focuses on aspects of democratic politics and development, particularly gender, development, political representation, and political institutions, and specializes in politics and policy in India. She is the former convener 2008 to 2016 of the Politics of South Asia Specialist Group of the UK's Political Studies Association. Welcome, Dr. Carole.
Thank you for having me.
So I think we can just start off very briefly by giving a bit of a background to why we are specifically discussing women in politics, because what we have seen in the Lok Sabha elections of 2019 are two very interesting data points. I think we have had by far the highest turnout percentage for women. It was I think for the first time ever, it was almost as much, if not a little bit more than the total number of men voting. And second, I think we have had the largest cohort of women MPs enter parliament at any given point of time. So this suggests something very interesting is going on. How do we make sense of this? How do we unpack this? And this is something that since you have written the book on this, it's something that we can hopefully discuss over the course of the next 45 minutes or so.
Yes.
Sure, looking forward to it.
And, we'd love to start off by understanding what got you interested in this subject. Did it start with your doctoral research, or is it something that you started working on more recently?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it really goes back a bit before then. So when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and I was quite interested in political economy of development in particular. And so I was interested, became more interested in sort of the debate going on in India. There's a lot of fantastic literature, not just the mainstream sort of development studies literature, but also the sort of feminist approaches to development. So I really got kind of absorbed into those. And then when I did my master's degree, my dissertation supervisor, Dr. Andrew Wyatt at the University of Bristol, he's an expert in South Indian politics. And he really kind of infused me with an enthusiasm of South Indian politics in particular. But what I started, or what I was really captured by, was the role of women in Indian politics. And of course, starting with South Indian politics, you can't, but be aware of Jayalalitha, former chief minister, and just looking at these really sort of senior women in Indian politics. So I ended up doing that for my master's dissertation and went on to do a PhD on actually more about kind of gender and public policy. But through that sort of period of the PhD, I couldn't help but sort of be interested in sort of gender and politics in India, and not just in terms of policy representation, but also in politics, party politics, electoral politics. And that's then when I managed to get the postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Warwick after the PhD, working with Shirin Rai, who, I'd read a lot of her work for the PhD and was completely inspired by a lot of her writings, not just on political institutions, but also sort of feminist political economy of development as well. So that was really how I kind of got into studying sort of gender and Indian politics.
Right. And I think that also sort of is a nice segue to get into what we want to discuss. We had an earlier episode actually on the Ganatantra podcast where we discussed some of the issues and some of the structural barriers that women face. And maybe it might be worth interrogating or looking a little bit into deeper as to why we have seen the two data points that I just mentioned, that there has been a sudden increase in the women's turnout in the elections. And also we have seen a larger number of women get elected. Is it part of like a slow but steady progress, or is it just a one-off that may not necessarily get repeated?
Yeah, well, I think the closing sort of gender gap in voting turnout, so women becoming sort of turning out more and more in elections, I think that's been a fairly long process over at least sort of three sort of elections, and then this one as well. So sort of starting in about 2004, 2009, 2014, and Professor Rajaswari Deshpande at the University of Pune, she has written about this in the last election in 2014, kind of saying that, really seeing this closing of the gap, not in all states, as in still got some states that haven't closed the gap, but certainly some states that have really made efforts to kind of close that gap over the years. And I mean, in this election, it was really an arrival where you've got basically, it's almost exactly the same. I mean, last 2014 was only about 1.5 percentage points overall difference. But yeah, this one would really come together. In terms of more women elected, I mean, it has been a slow upward trend. I mean, in the book, we basically sort of saw this average 10% increase at every election. And of course, when you've only got 50 MPs, that's 5, and 60 MPs is 6. So this one is slightly higher than that. And I think that's probably the result of the two parties that really sort of made an effort to field more women candidates.
Mm-hmm. Which is the Trinamool Congress and the Biju Janata Dal. Which 40% of the Trinamool Congress's tickets were given to women, and for Biju Janata Dal just 33%. And they didn't do too badly as the parties themselves. They did manage, not as well as they did in 2014, but they managed to at least retain their hold. But in terms of the demographics of the women who have been elected, there's a tendency to see that a lot of them are sort of related to sitting politicians. They are so-called dynasts. Is that what is largely leading to this process, or are we seeing a somewhat more widening of the demographics of women who are getting into parliament?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there's a lot of sort of different, there's data to show that actually this parliament, even though it's basically, won by a majority of MPs from a party that sort of claims not to be dynastic, it does actually have a lot of dynastic MPs, and that's both men and women as well. So I think it's important to recognise that the dynastic sort of link is both male MPs and female MPs, because I think sometimes women MPs get a bit of women in politics get a bit of a sort of short straw in terms of being labelled with the dynastic critique, because family is really, really important. Family support, really important. And it provides networks, resources, recognition. And also it's not necessarily, often it's the parties that are selecting the sort of women with family links rather than necessarily, the women coming forward independently, saying that I'm part of a political family, etc. So I think there is a sense that, of course, there are definitely women in politics, but that have family connections. I also think that, when you look at who the dynasts are, sometimes they're from families where women have been, the previous generation in politics, and that maybe they've passed the mantle on to their daughter or to their niece or to their nephew in one case, I remember. So, yeah, I tend to sort of try to kind of unravel the complexity of that a little bit. But definitely we've seen, as you suggest, we've seen a range of women get involved in politics. They've got previous party links where they've held positions within parties, or they've got different kinds of skills and attributes, different kinds of backgrounds coming into politics. So just looking through the profiles of the women that have been elected, I think is quite interesting. Also, we saw a number of women dynasts who didn't get re-elected as well. So I don't think it's, I do think there's a diversity of women in politics.
Well, that's interesting. You spoke of other pathways that women take to get into parliament. And I am assuming that this holds true for assembly level elections as well, particularly around their participation in social movements. And I think you talk about this a little bit in your book as well. We'd love to know, there is a dominant narrative, like you mentioned, that women are dynasts, so they're supported by their family and they're sort of proxies for male members. That's another thing that's heard definitely in the context of lower levels of elections where there's reservation for women. But could you talk about and shed a little more light on how women have, follow other pathways to get into parliament, and how do they do it, and how do they build their narrative? How do they build their support for their candidacy? And, what do they do once they're in parliament?
Yeah, of course. It's really interesting. Even some of our very prominent senior women in politics they've taken different routes. So if you look at, for example, Mamta Banerjee's route, she came through the sort of student politics route, the youth Congress route as well, and also Sumitra Mahajan, who was a mayor, elected as mayor, so kind of coming through either sort of elected positions or through intra-party organisational positions, but also just a number of women who have come through come into politics through different kind of professional avenues, or whether they're sort of doctors that then think, actually I've got something to something to say, something to contribute to the political process, to governance. So there's definitely a range of different pathways. The other thing to think about is within parties, like what actually gets recognised as sort of a useful background to get into politics. And I think it differs across sort of different parties. So in some parties, it's really important that you are elected, as a district secretary in the party. Andrew White's done work on this in South India with Manikandan as well, another scholar working on South Indian politics.
Yeah.
And in terms of the intra-organisational sort of position, so it's really about the party trying to enable a space for women to develop their skills and experience and to make a difference within the party that can then sort of provide a platform for them getting elected. But of course, women come in from outside without that sort of connection, but are approached by political leaders. And even if you're going back to women that joined politics in sort of 1980s, 1970s, 1980s.
So once women are in parliament, there is some evidence to show, and I think you do talk about it in your book as well, that the reserved seats do have more women candidates. I think as a proportion of the seats that are that are held by reserved candidates, women tend to do better in these seats. So we'd love to understand a little bit more about why that could happen, but also does that make a difference in the way women perform politics in parliament itself? And how do these sort of intersectional identities play out? Do they matter in terms of the kinds of questions they ask, or in terms of the participation in parliament itself?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So Francesca Jensenius did some work on this. She's got a 2017 paper, I think it is, in Government and Opposition, an academic journal, that really sort of tried to get at this these patterns where women are often nominated in either seats reserved for scheduled caste or scheduled tribe reserved seats. And when we say women tend to do better in these seats, I think it's actually a case of where they're nominated and then they get elected. So it's actually the party really deciding where they're going to contest, and then they get elected, rather than necessarily women being nominated in both, in all of the categories, and then women tending to do better in those particular seats. So if you look at, for example, the BJD's recent initiative, 6 out of the 7 women MPs that were nominated and got into Parliament, 6 of those are in reserved seats. So they've actually been nominated in seats sort of disproportionately in terms of the seats that are available in the state. And in terms of whether it influences how women perform their representative duties in Parliament, I think that's a fascinating question, because it really gets to the question of, one, how does sort of ascriptive identity really not just drive their own individual sort of priorities, but also how parties see their role in Parliament. What do they expect women to be doing in Parliament? What kind of issues do they expect women to be raising? Also, what kind of issues do they delegate to women to raise? And across different sort of issues related to identity. So in the book, we tried to kind of complicate that sort of that issue, or that connection between an ascriptive identity and what MPs, to try to avoid a kind of an assumption that women of a particular identity will represent particular issues, because there's so many different identities all wrapped into one in any given individual that it's we started from a position of, well, what do women represent, and how does that necessarily link to those identities? So it is very interesting. When we looked at sort of the profile of women MPs, I mean, one of the big, more high-profile cases is Mira Kumar, who was elected as the Speaker in 2009. And just to try to kind of peel back the different layers of that process in relation to symbolic representation is really interesting, because there's a lot of expectations that are put on her as a woman, first female Speaker of the Lok Sabha, to represent women's issues. But of course, a lot of the debates around Dalit representation as well, and thinking about her role as like a role model for representation. But of course, there's so many different formats for sort of Dalit representation in India as well, like the different ways in which representatives have sort of chosen to incorporate that into the political system. Complicated.
Yeah, I know that. And this sort of complication, I thought I'll just mention one particular data point, which I guess is confounding a lot of people. And what you've just said actually helps us understand this a lot better. For instance, Kerala got its second ever woman Dalit MP in Ramya Haridas, who won this time on the UDF ticket. And in as much as she's a Dalit woman MP, her position on the whole Sabrimala issue, whether women should be allowed to enter the temple, or women of menstruating age should be allowed to enter the temple, was firmly in line with the Congress's position. So, or rather the UDF's position there. So, in a sense, like, in as much as people sort of framed the Sabrimala issue as a caste and a gender issue, as a Dalit candidate and also as somebody from the Congress party, her position was and continues to be that no, it's not, it's a matter of religion and so on and so forth. So in a sense, this sort of shows that it's actually much more, as you just sort of pointed out, much more complicated.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to read off, like you say, all of the different, whether actually they take a party line as opposed to a different kind of line. And I think it is a really interesting but complicated sort of web of different considerations. So we were looking at, there was a woman MP from the Punjab that was elected to a reserved constituency. And, when we looked at the kinds of issues that she raised throughout the parliament, she had various issues that she brought up at different times. And one of them was, related to her state and her constituency. So you've got aspects of identity, you've got constituency issues, you've got regional issues, you've got gender issues. So it really is a whole range of different issues that they can bring up at different points in time. But of course, and party issues as well, that it's a really sort of interesting combination of issues that it's very hard to sort of reduce it to any single thing. And I think one of the things that I've been very much interested in is not just about thinking about representatives as, of course, they're individuals with agency around what they decide to represent. But of course, there's also norms around what they think they should be representing, but also what their party thinks they should be representing. And also the openings, institutional openings for them to do so or not. So in any given debate, they may not actually get speaking rights on that particular debate because they're in competition with a lot of other MPs that want to speak on that issue as well. So it's fascinating in many ways, and I think it's hard to really kind of extricate those issues from each other, but definitely worth looking into and having a go at that, because it's really interesting to see how complicated it is to perform representation.
That's very interesting. I'd like to step back actually to one of the points you made earlier around whether women were securing nominations in certain kinds of seats. And so some of it, and also the actions of the BJD and the Trinamool Congress in giving about a third of their seats, tickets to women candidates. I wanted to understand a little bit more about what kinds of parties. Is it the kind of party, or is it leadership, or what is it about political parties that do this better than others? So are certain kinds of parties more successful or more able or more willing to bring on women candidates into the fold by giving them tickets?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, you see a real variation, not just among parties. Obviously there's parties that are very state specific, and there's the national parties. And I mean, whenever I was looking at the BJP nominations statewide, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the Congress and the BJD, but then looking at the BJP, for example, in Maharashtra, that managed to nominate sort of, I think it was like 28% of women from their, in their candidates from Maharashtra. But of course, in other states, there's very few women. So when we look at the aggregate national figure for the BJP, it's certainly that in some states it's possible, and in other states it's not so possible. And if you look at when we talk about intersections and the reserved constituencies, if you look at, for example, the BJP's profile of who they nominated, it was much lower in terms of scheduled caste reserve seats for women, but it was higher, proportionately higher in scheduled tribe reserve constituencies. So, and that's actually now reflected in Parliament as well, because of course the BJP has got sort of more than half of women MPs in Parliament. So that's interesting. I mean, I was just thinking about the number of different parties and that kind of profile of reserved constituencies. So the Trinamool Congress had a higher proportion of their women candidates in scheduled caste reserve seats. So if you've got like 15% in Parliament, scheduled caste reserve seat constituencies, the Trinamool Congress had 22% of their women candidates in that kind of seat as well. So it was disproportionately higher.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Francesca Jansenia said was that, I hope I'm sort of quoting her correctly, was that sometimes parties find it useful to nominate sort of one kind of minority. Obviously, they're not a minority in the population, but one kind of minority in politics with another, and combine those kind of minority or minority communities in candidate nominations. But of course, what that means then is that the general seats are more open then to sort of men in politics as well. So there's it's hard to really get at what the politics of that are without sort of, assuming that they're doing that as a strategy. But there are some clear patterns that does actually happen.
Right. And to shift the focus slightly away from women MPs and candidates, one of the things that is sort of, I don't know if it's sufficiently examined, it's about women voting as a group. We sort of have various vote banks or vote blocks or whatever the term that's used, women voting as a group on women's, or what they feel are women's issues and stuff like that. So for the longest time, I think there was a belief that Jayalalitha used to corner the women's vote in Tamil Nadu. And very interestingly, there is at least some very initial data, at least from the CSDS Lokniti survey, that a very significant part of Modi's appeal, apart from the whole national issues, local issues, was the fact that certain well-designed schemes for women, such as, the Ujjwala Yojana, which was a free LPG cylinder, free gas cylinder and stuff scheme, as also the free construction of toilet scheme, were seen as, at least by a lot of women, as having helped women. And I wonder if is that something that more politicians are going for? We know Nitish Kumar sort of introduced prohibition as saying that I got this feedback from rural women in Bihar. But do we see more politicians doing that going forward in India?
Yeah, that's a fascinating dynamic, I think, because I think there's certainly more attention to this now as well because of the voting gap, the gender gap being closed. Of course, the voter turnout gap isn't necessarily the same thing as the party support gap, which, like you say, has been an interesting issue, like whether Jayalalitha has had more support among women. One state that I'm really interested in particular in this dynamic is West Bengal.
Right.
Because, of course, the left used to have a much, good sort of gender advantage among women voters in the past. And then Mamata Banerjee managed to kind of shift those women voters to support her. And, more support among women than men, but obviously overall the support shifted to her party away from the left in West Bengal. But then in this election, what I'd be very interested, and I haven't yet seen the data on this, and it wasn't in one of the states that was listed in the article in the Hindu from the Lokniti data.
Right.
But is the question I'm interested in is whether the BJP in West Bengal in this election managed to swing women voters away from the Trinamool Congress in disproportionate amounts. And I'm wondering whether that played a part in the shift or in sort of the swing towards the BJP slightly, or whether actually the BJP were able to capture some of the male voters away from the Trinamool Congress and not necessarily the women voters, because Mamata Banerjee's had various programs that's supporting women and girls as well in terms of education, etc. So I'm really interested to see that data. Right. I think the BJP has been, from that data, we see that the BJP has closed its gender gap in support a little bit, really not, it's like 1 percentage point, I think. So there's still an overall disadvantage among women voters for that party. But, and we look at it in particular states like Madhya Pradesh, 7-point difference. I mean, that could be potentially huge in terms of outcomes. Rajasthan, a 5 percentage point difference, and Delhi, a 4 percentage point difference. Right. And I think there was a discussion before when the Aam Aadmi Party came into power that they had a slight advantage among women voters. Yes. But, then look at Chhattisgarh, and Chhattisgarh being a 9 percentage point advantage among women in favour of the BJP. So I think it is really interesting to see what effect that's having on politicians. We saw just a couple of days ago, Jagan Mohan Reddy of the YSR Congress in Andhra Pradesh has increased the pay of Anganwadi workers by 300%. Yes. Yeah. And that's, obviously long overdue because they are very sort of underpaid for the labour that they perform and the importance of what they do in terms of nutrition and those kind of things and health goals. Mm-hmm. So it's really fascinating. I think definitely there's a narrative that, we, like you rightly point out, that really is kind of associated with Nitish Kumar in Bihar around trying to sort of capture women's votes and making sure that programs are in place to support that appeal to women voters. Now, the only other distinction I would make is that sometimes those programs might be more geared towards practical interests. So the things that women do in their existing gender roles and not necessarily towards kind of strategic change in terms of gender roles and status. But you know what? Sometimes actually that may be what's the most pressing as well, is to address some of the sort of immediate material deprivations and drudgery and those kind of things in that immediate sort of context. I definitely agree. It's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it's interesting also because Jagan Mohan Reddy, who has increased the pay of ASHA workers, has 5 deputy chief ministers from different minority communities, but not a single woman. Yeah. So it's interesting to think about how identities are ascribed and also what it means for gender. But I'd like to again go back, I think, a little bit to some of your work on parliamentarians. I think one of the most interesting parts of your work is sort of the interviews that you do with parliamentarians, with women parliamentarians, and how they see themselves. It's interesting because a lot of the popular narrative around women politicians is fairly gendered. So whether you think of Hillary Clinton in the US or some of our own leaders here, Sonia Gandhi, Mamata Banerjee and Mayawati, perceptions of them, their gender identity is something that comes strongly into play. But how do they see themselves? Do they see themselves as women politicians? Is gender an important aspect of what they're thinking about in their relationship with politics? Would love to hear a little bit more about that from you.
Yeah, I think it's just really varied. I think women come into politics. I mean, certainly years ago we saw sort of women in politics were not quite agreed about, this idea of reservation, for example. They wanted to sort of show that they could make it on their own, that they didn't want women's reservation. But as we've seen over time, a number of senior women in politics have come out and said, well, actually, we know that parties aren't going to give up these seats without some kind of compulsion. So actually, what's needed is women's reservation. So there's, in terms of thinking about themselves as women in a male-dominated field, I think we've seen change over time in terms of the realisation of the sort of practical realities of that. But definitely, when we spoke to women MPs, some pointed to some really sort of obvious things, like whether it's to do with campaigning and how that is a sort of quite a male-dominated space. And some pointed to things where they managed to get around those kinds of issues, or that they just kind of accept that and they know that that's what they're getting into, which obviously isn't what they should have to sort of accept. They're kind of very much aware. I mean, some women that have really come from the ground, grassroots politics, have very much become accustomed to having to sort of fight their way into debates and probably not the right way of putting it, but in terms of basically commanding their own space and being able to, really hold their own when it comes to sort of political debates and those kind of things. So they know that it's a male-dominated space, and they know that, and some women, having been through that at a more local level, come into politics with not just an awareness of that, but a kind of skill development and training in that sort of terrain. But other women that we interviewed, I mean, I remember a couple where, when I was asking them about what's it like to try to, put your issues forward in Parliament, do you feel that there's a gender disadvantage in terms of getting your voice heard in Parliament? And some women, pointed out that, sometimes it's very hard to get women's issues on the agenda in the parliamentary sort of legislative agenda. And sometimes it helps to have senior women on the sort of business committee, the House committee that decides the legislative agenda with the government. But other women MPs really made a point of saying, look, of course, sometimes in debates it might be difficult, but there's plenty of other ways that you can raise your issues in Parliament through different mechanisms, like whether it's questions or whether it's the different mechanisms where you can raise constituency issues, or you can put forward your own kind of mechanisms, like with calling attention and these kinds of different debates. So there was a real diversity of mechanisms available to them. But of course, some of the most high-profile ones are still kind of difficult barriers to access those sorts of debates as well. So, yeah, so I think there's a diversity in terms of how they think of themselves as a group. Parties, of course, are a really strong identity still as well. But there's definitely issues that women across parties come together on as well. And sometimes the kind of trips to international conferences and workshops, or national kind of, being outside of Delhi and being away as a committee, for example, like on a committee study visit, that can actually, kind of allow women to get to know each other more and share experiences. So, yeah, I think it's varied.
So, actually, Carole, just taking on that point specifically, because, looking back through history a little bit, when India's constitution was drawn up in the Constituent Assembly, the women members there, even though they were a much smaller percentage than in Parliament today, a lot of historians consider them to be perhaps the most well-organized and the most vocal and effective pressure group within the Constituent Assembly. And they cut across a whole different set of classes. You had Dakshayani Vela, then you had a lot of other women as well, in terms of from upper caste and so on. But they were able to work together to get their demands put forth in a very coherent and a very cogent manner that sort of still is there in the Constitution. And they pushed back against some of the more egregious attempts to push away women's rights. I wonder if maybe it's not been possible to replicate it, perhaps given the party system. But in your interviews, did you see, and since you just happened to mention in the last bit, did you see that there is a beginning of some sort of like a women's lobby or a women's lobby group within Parliament itself, cutting across party lines, of course?
Yeah, I think we did definitely see some of that around the passage of the Women's Reservation Bill in the Rajya Sabha, where there's this kind of fairly famous photo of Sushma Swaraj, Brinda Karat, and I think it was Najma Heptullah, that are in this kind of frame together, holding hands, kind of, feeling sort of victorious about what they'd managed to achieve in getting the bill passed. But of course, it didn't end up getting passed in the Lok Sabha. So definitely, I think women have come together to try to lobby on certain issues. And I think there's also I mean, it is an interesting question. To what extent has the party sort of lines actually divide women where they could be coming together? I think it is an issue. Sometimes it's an issue by issue thing. So I remember in the domestic violence debate, across parties, there was kind of support for the bill across, government and opposition. There was support for the bill, and both, women from different sides of the House kind of trying to, sort of disagree with some of the MPs that were not supporting the bill as well. So I think the Women's Reservation Bill, definitely there's a lot of cross-party support on that. There's a new collective, Political Shakti, that's been doing work, non-partisan collective, bringing women in politics together to try to kind of think about how to bring more women into politics, how to sort of encourage the passage of the Women's Reservation Bill and campaign on different things. So when you have those kinds of efforts, those kind of non-partisan efforts that are coming from the outside, I think that helps. Bring women into the same sort of spaces to talk with each other. But certainly, when you have spaces where women can come together, I mean, we saw Sumitra Mahajan put together the first national conference on women legislators under her sort of period as speaker. And, it's fairly amazing that was the first time that such a conference was held. Of course, there have been plenty of conferences where women MPs have come together on particular thematic issues, but to bring women MLAs from different states, women MPs together, have the conference organised by women MPs, like a smaller committee of women MPs overseen by the speaker. Mira Kamar did something similar in her period as speaker, her speakership, where she organised a conference that led to the New Delhi Declaration about sort of gender-sensitive parliament. I think that was Commonwealth related. So she hosted a number of parliamentarians from outside India as well. So that's, another kind of example of them bringing together. But certainly, I mean, the other kind of example, I guess, of a more formal caucus, but not necessarily sort of voluntarily kind of coming together as a group, is the Committee for the Empowerment of Women in Parliament, which is, predominantly female. The membership is predominantly female, and sort of, usually a minority of male MPs on the committee. And of course, that means they sit around the table looking at different issues, deciding the agenda. But of course, because it's not open, we can't always get a sense of how that committee works, like in practice. And so in the book, we tried to sort of rely on different reports and interviews with women that have been members of that committee over different parliaments to try and get a sense of how it works. And there is a lot of positivity around that committee. And in fact, I think it was in Margaret Alver's autobiography, she talks about a number of ways in which she wanted to, really lead on women's issues in the parliament. So you do have some women that are really conscious of their role in trying to represent women's issues in terms of gender equality in particular.
Yes.
We're almost out of time, but I thought I'd sort of wrap up with one final question which sort of tries to tie a lot of these threads that we've discussed together. And I think Saryu sort of hinted at it a little bit specifically. Is there something specific about conservative parties that makes them promote women? I mean, this is actually a conversation which came out with Saryu and me. And I just thought that just the pattern at least seems to make sense to me because,
It seems like that.
Yeah.
There's the two British PMs.
Yes, Margaret Thatcher and, almost her term has ended a bit. Hasn't yet, she hasn't formally resigned yet, Theresa May. But Angela Merkel, also technically conservative party, although she moved much differently in her times.
But is there something that they do that allows them to have sort of senior leadership? It's harder to put parties like the BSP and the Trinamool into these conservative versus not buckets, are they structured differently that allow women to rise? Because the Mahila Morcha, for example, in the BJP is very active.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it's a real fascinating one because, I think certainly in the UK, the Conservative Party used that as a kind of a bit of a stick to bash the Labour Party with because they haven't had a female prime minister. I mean, it's interesting as well because in India, the left, apart from sort of Peter Mukherjee, who was a long-serving parliamentarian, very sort of senior leader in the left parties, and of course Brinda Karat is very, very senior leader.
Right.
Sometimes we don't actually see the number of women candidates standing for these parties in terms of nomination, and they have a really, really sort of solid network of women sort of active in politics in the party. We don't necessarily see them in leadership positions or get much of a chance. So unfortunately that is, of course, because there's some really active women, and when we looked at the women that have been raising issues in Parliament for women, in favour of women, on women's interests, that often it is the left MPs, whether Rajya Sabha or Lok Sabha, that really do speak in women's interests. So it would be great to see the left give more chances, but of course, they have their own sort of limitations in the Indian context now, where the electorate tends to be shifting towards more sort of right-wing politics. The Conservative parties, of course, the popularity of women in those parties can also be as a result of actually promoting sort of fairly conservative gender roles as well. So actually women drawing moral authority from a fairly conservative, position, either as mothers, that kind of, or as a traditional sort of women's roles in society, and drawing that sort of moral authority from that position. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every woman in politics, yes, she, by virtue of being in a male-dominated field, she's, kind of more of an outlier in that respect. But it could also be that she gains kind of moral authority. And there was a long debate about, which I don't think is always a helpful debate, but whether, women are less corrupt, and that's why parties, sort of look to women to kind of, sort of rebalance the sort of moral capital in parties and politics. I'm not always sure that's a really useful debate, because as we know, corruption happens. It doesn't really, not gender specific, I don't think. No. The other thing I wanted to just come back to on the point before about women and representation within Parliament. We seem to kind of look at women and expect them to represent women's issues, but of course all male MPs have female constituents.
Right.
So I think there's a really interesting expectation that women should be representing women's issues, when actually every male MP needs to be representing women's issues, because every male MP has women voters in their constituency.
Yes.
But the whole Conservative parties, I mean, there's a lot of literature internationally on this about women in right-wing parties, what the constraints are within those parties, but also the different kinds of spaces. And sometimes it's about party organisation. So in the BJP, they've got kind of quotas around women in party posts within the organisation. And I know Theresa May was herself in the Conservative Party in the UK. She was actually part of, and Caroline Spelman as well, she was part of an initiative to try to bring more women into the Conservative Party, in a way to try to get rid of that kind of nasty Tory image as well. So it was a kind of a way of feminising the Conservative Party to give it a more appealing image as well. So, it's a fascinating question. I think there's a lot of work been done in the Indian context on this by historians looking at women in right-wing politics as well, particularly on the Hindu right. So, I'll defer to them, because some of their literature is just fantastic.
Yes.
That's all we have time for, and thank you, Carole. That was a really, really interesting episode.
Yes, it's given us a lot to think about and undone some of, popular narratives that exist around women in politics, around whether they come from dynasties, how they rise within parties, and whether certain parties are more able to or are more willing to, and how do they actually practice having more women in politics.
Yeah.
But thank you very much. This has been a great experience.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It's really interesting discussing it all. I mean, it's it feels like it's a shifting terrain, and the elections in India obviously keep us all busy. We're trying to understand the different dynamics. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode. We should be back soon with more episodes.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
Janice, what do you think couples did before TV was invented?
I don't know, go for walks on the beach, long drives, fancy dinners, have more sex maybe?
But what did we do when we decided to move in together? We debated between the Chromecast and the Fire Stick.
We gave up on sleeping early so we could stay up watching true crime shows.
We got ourselves 3 cat babies.
And basically became the cutest couch potatoes around.
Okay then.
In case you guys still haven't got it, we are a TV crazy, Netflix loving, binge watching Mr. and Mrs.
I'm Anirudh Guha.
I'm Janice Sequeira.
And if like us, you snort TV for breakfast, lunch and dinner, this is the podcast for you.
Tune in every Thursday on the IVM podcast app or wherever it is that you get your podcast from. This is
Mr.
and Mrs.
Binge Watch.